Tov to is Nazir Nun Vav Nazir 56, and we're going to start just by reminding ourselves of what Rav Chisda taught on the bottom of 55a. On the bottom of 55a, Rav Chisda said that we had said that if the person was a Nazir and then he became a Matzorah, that the Mishnah had said that he goes through his purification process and then he starts to resume his count of his Nazirus. But meaning to say, while he's a Nazir, while he's a Matzorah, those days don't count towards his Nazirus. But Rav Chisda comes along and says, when do we say that while he's a Matzorah, his days don't count towards his Nazirus? When it's a Nazir Mu'etes, when it's just a minimum days of 30 Nazirus, because we need to have the Giluach Seyar, we need to have a cutting of the hair after 30 days. But if it would be a Nazirus Meruba, but if it would be a longer Nazirus, then we would say that under those circumstances, the days of the Matzorah actually do count towards his Nazirus. So the Gemara on the bottom of 55b cites a question against Rav Chisda from Rami Bar Chama. So on the bottom of 55b, Masav Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama asks the following question. In order to really understand this question, we have to review a few basic laws. So first of all, the Nazir, when he completes his Nazirus, he has to bring 3 sacrifices: the Ola, the Chatas, and the Shlamim, and he shaves his hair. If he is a Nazirus Tameh, he also brings 3 sacrifices and shaves his hair, and he starts his count again in order to complete his Nazirus. But these are 3 different sacrifices. This is the Ola, the Chatas, and the Asha. So that's one aspect. Another halacha that we have to know is that the Matzorah goes through also a double process. That first, once he becomes, there's a few stages. If he's not sure if he's a Matzorah, if the Kohen goes to the Kohen, Kohen's not sure, so the Kohen says you're confined in quarantine. That's called a Matzorah Muskar. So then he's quarantined for 1 or 2 weeks. If at the end of that we determine he's a Nazir, a Matzorah, or if the Kohen determines from the beginning, then it's called a Matzorah Muchat. He's a certain Matzorah. The certain Matzorah has 2 periods of time. He has the Yemei Gamra, that he has to wait 7 days, and then he brings 2 birds, and then he starts to count 7 days. And on the day that he counts, we're going to say that after he counts 7 days of Yemei Gamra, he cuts his hair, and he brings 2 birds and he cuts his hair, and then he counts another 7 days, which is called Yemei Safro. And then after those period of time, the second counting, he also cuts his hair, and he brings a series of offerings. Either he brings, depending on the amount of money he has. If he's poor, he brings 2 birds for Chatas and an Oah. If he's wealthier, he brings a sheep for an Asham and a Kivsa for a Chatas, and then another Keves for an Oah. We know that there are 4 requirements. 4 people in the Torah who have to cut their hair. They're obligated to is the Nazir when he's Tameh, when he's Tahor, and also the Matzorah, that one right after he brings the 2 birds and the first ritual, and then second after he counts another 7 days as part of his Yemei Safra. And so the difference between the Matzorah and the Nazir is that the Nazir cuts all the hair off of his head, whereas the Matzorah cuts the hair off of all of his body. Now, one of the Gemara is going to tell us on Daf Samach that the haircut for the Matzorah cannot double dip as the haircut also for the Nazir. They have to be separate. But while you're cutting your hair for your Matzorah, it overrides the cutting the hair for the Nazirus, except if you're just an uncertain Matzorah, then you can't cut the hair for a certain Nazir. These are some basic laws. So now we're going to challenge Rav Chisda's point, which Rav Chisda had said, that while you're a Matzorah, if it's a Nazirus Meruba, if it's a longer Nazirus, it could count the days can count for a Nazir. So the Gemara asks the following point. Nazir shayatame b'safek. So we're not sure if this Nazir was tame or not. So if he was certainly tame, he would cut his hair after he becomes purified after a week. But since he's just unsure if he's tame, we're going to have to go through the period process of maybe he was not tame, so then therefore he can't cut it till 30 days in case he was a real Nazir. And also, umuchat pasafik, also we're not sure if he's a mitzora. If we were sure he was a mitzora, he'd be able to cut his hair after day 7, day 14. But since we're not sure if he's a mitzora, we're going to have to wait until day 30 twice in order to cut his hair, because maybe he was tameh also, so we're going to have to add in the extra time. So under these circumstances, our Brisa tells us, ochal b'kodshim, he's going to eat the sacrificial food. We're on top of 56a. He can only eat the sacrificial food after 60 days because Metzora can't eat the sacrificial food. So he can't go through the process until after 60 days of the purification. First 30 in case he was a Metzora. Then it counts another 7 days, but it can't just be 7 days. We have to do 30 days in case maybe he was also Nazir at that time. If it shows the yain in the time of Amazim, and he can only drink the wine and come in contact with the dead after 120 days, because we have to be concerned that maybe the first two times he cut his hair was only for a mitzora, and so therefore the last 2 times have to be for maybe he was a Nazir Tameh and maybe it was a Nazir Tahor. Vitania, and we said about this price about Medvar Mamurim Benazir Muatis. When do we say that it's 120 days, which is basically 30 times 4? That's only Benaziris Muatis, where it's a minimum Naziris of only 30 days of Benaziris Bashana. But if the Naziris would be, he took upon himself a Naziris of 1 year, then Ochel B'Kodshim Achar Shtei Shanim, then everything is going to be 4 times 1 times the 1 year. So under those circumstances, excuse me, he'd be able to eat the kachem after 2 years, just like before he could eat the kachem after 60 days. The shows the yayin and be able to drink the wine and come in contact with the dead only after our Vashanim, only after 4 years. But now the Gemara asks the question, and if you want to say like Rav Chisda that you could count the days while you're in Mitzora, you can count those days towards a Nazir. So then, we should count one of those days, should be able to, one of those periods of time should be able to also count as the 1 year of the Nazirus. And he should only need 3 years and 30 days. He should only need 3 years and 30 days. So that's a question against Rav Chisda. So the Gemara says, that was one question against Rav Chisda. And the second question against Rav Chisda, Va'od Masav Rav Ashi, Eli Ela Yemei Tuma, She'ein Owen Lo Minamin. So also Rav Ashi challenges it from another brisa, that the brisa says, we learned in the Sifri, I only know that in Nazir Tameh, that we're talking about here about a Nazir Muates. So it says, well, that's going to be the point of the brisa. It says, I only know that if he is a Nazir who is Tameh, then under those circumstances, we're going to say that those days don't count for his Nazirus because it's Oseris. It knocks out his days because I only know you made too much in all. You made chiluto minayin. How do I know that if it was a certain mitzora, those days also don't count towards his minion? And Mar says, "V'dinu, we'll learn that from a kavachomer. You made tuma megaleach umevi korban. If he is actually tamei, if he is a nazir who's tamei, he's going to cut his hair. The nazir has to cut his hair, and he also has to bring a korban. And meaning at the end of his tuma period, he has to bring actually 3 karbanos, but one is specifically the asham. Ma yemei tuma, so ein owen woman a minion. Just like the yemei tuma, those days while he was tamei do not count towards his nazirus. Af yemei chiluto ein owen woman a minion. Also, the days where he's an actual mitzora will not count towards his nazirus. Gemara says, no, you can't prove that. Well, imam amres be made tuma. So if you want to say by made tuma, his days don't count towards his Nazirus. Because there it's so serious, he actually knocks out his earlier days. Tomer ben Mechalut, are you going to say this by his days of a Mitzorah? Well, those days don't knock out your earlier days. They don't knock out your earlier days by a Mitzorah. So the Gemara says, well, Amras Kavachomer. So we're going to say it like a Kavachomer. Ma Nazir b'kever. Just like if the Nazir had actually been in the graveyard when he accepted upon himself as Nazirus. And then we don't require him to, under those circumstances, we say that, meaning to say he doesn't need to cut his hair at that point before he starts to count as Nazirus or Tahara, even though if he had been Tameh after he became a Nazir, we would have made him. But since he started out as in the graveyard, we don't make him cut his hair. And yet still those days, well, he was in the cemetery, don't count towards his Nazirus. But if he was an actual Mitzorah where he's going to have to cut the hair off from his body and also his head, obviously. So therefore, his hair that he has currently is not appropriate for the Nazir hair because he's going to have to start over. Nazirus, whoa, kol shekain. So on she'ein sarah ro'el tegachas Nazirus. Well, kol shekain, for sure we should say that those days don't count towards his Nazirus. So therefore, so I see that a Yemechiluto do not count towards his Nazirus. Yemei Safra Minayan. So again, we said that there are Yemei Gamro, which is the first 7 days of his Mitzorah ritual. And then the Yemei Safra, he has to count another 7 days. So I only learned from this first piece, from this Kavachomer Yemei Chiluto, that the first days of his Mitzorah period don't count towards his Nazirus. How do I know that the next second period of 7 days also don't count towards his Nazirus? Mar says, we're going to learn it out. We're on top of 56b. We're going to learn that from a Kavachomer. It's just like it's really not a Kavachomer, it's really a comparison here. Just like the days of his certain Nazirus, i.e. Yemei Gamro, just like those days require a haircut. Af Yemei Safro. So to the second period of Mitzorah, the second 7 days require a haircut. And just like while he is in Mitzorah, those days don't count towards the minyan, don't count towards the Nazirus. Safra. Also the days of his second period of 7 counting don't count towards his minyan. I might think that also Yemei the days where he's confined, I might think that they also don't count towards the Nazirus. But Dimno saying, and it's logical to assume so, because Chalot Mitame Mishkav Moshav, because just like the first period of your Mitzorah period, which is the Chalot, your Mitame by lying down on something and sitting down on something, Bimei Eskaro Mitame Mishkav Moshav. And also while you're in Mitzorah Muskar, while you're in your quarantine to determine if you're a Mitzorah, you're also Matami Mishkav and Moshev. So therefore, so maybe we should say, if just like the days of your Chalut and your first days of your Mitzorah don't count towards your days of Nazir, so to the days of quarantine, the Me'eskaro should not count towards your minyan. Amras low. No, we say we're not going to say that. Amras b'mei chaluto. If you would say this by the days of your chaluto that they don't count to the minyan, shkin chaluto tam teglachas, because that requires a haircut at the end of it, or maybe carbon. And you have to bring a sacrifice. And therefore they don't count towards the minyan. Tomar b'mei eskaro. Are you going to say this by the days of the confinement? She'ain tam teglachas. They don't require a haircut. Be'eno maybe carbon, and he doesn't bring a carbon. So therefore, you may escare the days of the confinement, they do count towards this period of his Nazirus. Mikana Amru, from here they taught you may suffer, you may gamro in olam minyan. From here they taught that you may gamro the first days of your Mitzorah period, the first 7 days, and also you may suffer the second 7 days of your Mitzorah period. They don't count towards his period of his Nazirus. But the Zav and the Zava, somebody who was tamei from a male, from an emission from his body, called a zav, and a mitzvah, and a zava, a woman who has an irregular flow, and has gerishal mitzvah, and the mitzvah was confined to determine whether or not he's an actual mitzvah, right? These do count towards his. They do count towards his nazirs. But anyway, why is this a proof? Because what do we say in this price? Katani mias. Well, we had said in this price, and no, ima amres be made tuma shecame mevatal b'anas hakodmin. If you're going to say that we had said you can't learn from the mecheluto, you can't learn from the days of the confinement, the days of the certain mature period, to the days of the askero, to the days of confinement, that we had tried to learn from Yemei Chiluto that since those days don't count towards the minion, we tried to learn from Yemei Askero that the days of the quarantine, they also shouldn't count to the minion. And the Bryce had rejected it, said, well, Imam must be made Tumah. If you want to say this by so hold on, I just want to get the exact version on the Bryce. Imam must be made Tumah. If you want to say this, you can't say this. Why? Imam must be made. So we said Imam must be made Tumah. If you say this in the days of the Tumah of the Nazir, Shekim Vata Benas HaKodmin, that it knocks out the earlier days. Tomar b'mechiluto, or you want to say this by mechiluto, that it doesn't knock out its earlier days, and so therefore we can't prove from here. And so therefore you can prove from here that from the Yemei Tumah to Yemei Sifra. This was what the Bryce said at the very beginning of the Bryce when we had tried to prove. We had tried to prove at the very beginning that the Yemei Chiluto should. We had said, going back to the beginning of the Bryce, or Rashi had said, you made too much, and how do we know that the days of the Mitzorah also don't count towards the minion? And we had tried to prove from a Kavachomer. What was the attempt at Kavachomer? You made Tumah Megaleach, that you made Tumah of the Nazir, you cut your hair and you bring a carbon. And also you made Chiluto of the Mitzorah, you cut your hair and you bring a carbon. And so just like you made Tumasa don't count for the minion, also you made Chiluto of the Mitzorah should not count for the minion. And the Bryce had rejected it, said, no, if you say this by the made Tumah, she came in Vatal by Nasakomin, the Nazir knocks out the earlier days. Are you going to say this by Mechiluto? It doesn't knock out its earlier days. So that was the rejection. So the Gemara says, so how is this a proof against Rav Chisda? B'mai, what are we talking about? Well, Imam must be made Tumah. If you want to say this by made Tumah of the Nazir, Shekim Evalta by Nasakodmin, we're going to say it also by the Yemei Chiluto of the Mitzorah, which does not knock out its earlier days. B'mai, what are we talking about? Ilema ben Nazirus Muates. If you want to say it's talking about a minimum Nazirus of 30 days, but then it does knock out its earlier days because Habayin and Gidol Ser, we require a minimum growth of 30 days. But we must be talking about a Nazirus Meruba, a longer Nazirus. The Katani Shein Olom and a minion. And we're still saying in that circumstance, it doesn't count towards his days of Nazirus. Alma, we see from here, we see from here against Rav Chisda that these days of the Mitzorah don't count towards the minion, they don't count towards the 30 days. Shmamina, we learn it from here. Okay, so now we have basically rejected Rav Chisda's point, and we see that they don't count for a minion by a Nazirus Meruba either. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Mishum Rabbi Yeshua, Kol Tumah Min Ames. We had said in the previous two Mishnayos, one had said all those ritual impurities, Tumah from a dead body, that the Nazir does have to cut his hair and start over. And then we had seen in the next Mishnah, which is i.e. the previous Mishnah, those Tumahs from a dead body, where there was a doubt about it, that we said that the Nazir doesn't have to cut his hair over those circumstances, or maybe it was too small amount. So that's what Rabbi Eliezer says in the name of Rabbi Yeshua, called Tumah Min Ames, Nazir Migalech Aleha. If the Nazir would have to cut his hair and start over his count, then in a related law, if he entered into the temple after having become tummy in that manner, we're going to say he's going to be liable for entering into the temple while in a state of ritual impurity. The called tumah min ames she'ein nazir migalech and any tumah from that body that would not be the stage which the Nazir would have to cut his hair over. Then the Nazir would not be liable for entering into the temple in this state of ritual impurity. And Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Meir says no. This level of ritual impurity, which is okay, it's not going to mess up the Nazir's hair. Still, he's going to have to sprinkle ashes of red heifer on day 3 and day 7. And it's not more lenient than a sheretz. If you enter into the temple after having touched one of these rodents, these 8 shratzim, we're going to require you're going to be chayav kares. If you did it accidentally, you have to bring a carbon. And so we see from here, if that's the case by a sheretz, it for sure should be the case by a person who became tamei mace, even though he doesn't have to cut his hair if he's a nazir as a result of that tamah. So the Gemara first challenge is, where does Rabbi Eliezer really get this from? Are you saying he got it from Rabbi Yeshua, which stam Rabbi Yeshua in the Talmud is Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya? Do you really want to say this? Rabbi Eliezer Mishum Rabbi Yeshua Gamara? Did he really learn it out from Rabbi Yeshua? Mishum Rabbi Yeshua bar Mamel Gamara. We know he learned it out from Rabbi Yeshua bar Mamel. The Tanya Amar Rabbi Eliezer Keshalachti la Ardaskia. One time I was going to Ardaskia. Umatsasi es Rabbi Yeshua ben Potter Rosh Shaya Yoshe V'dan. I found Rabbi Yeshua ben Potter was the Rosh Yeshiva, and he was sitting there and studying the Torah. Named Rabbi Meir Ba'alacha, and he was sitting there and studying Rabbi Meir and the halacha of Kol Tumah Min HaMeis Shenazir Megalech Aleh Chayav Min Olam Mishum Bias Mikdash. He says that halacha that any, like our Mishnah, any tumah that the Nazir would have to cut his hair for, then he's going to be liable for entering into the temple. And any tumah from a dead body, that even though he's tamei mace, the Nazir will not cut his hair over. Then the Nazir will not be responsible, will not be liable for a carbon or kares if he entered into the temple. And Amaro, and then Rabbi Meir responded to Rabbi Yeshua ben Potter and said the following. He said, no, it should not be the case. You should still be chayav, just like you're chayav for a sharet, so too you're liable for a tumas mace, even though you're not, the Nazir doesn't have to cut his hair over it. Amartilo, and then Rabbi Eliezer piped up and he said, Kuma tabaki Rabbi Yeshua Marmo, and I said to him, I said to Rabbi Meir, presumably to Rabbi Meir. There's different opinions amongst the Rishonim who he actually said this to. Did he say this to a Meir or Rabbi Shimon Peter? But anyway, Rabbi Eliezer says, Amartilo, I piped up, Kuma tabaki Rabbi Shimon Marmo, are you expert in Rabbi Shimon Marmo? Amali Hein. He said, yeah, I know him. So he says, Kach Amarli Rabbi Yeshua bar Marmo Mishum Rabbi Yeshua. He said, this is a teaching I heard from Rabbi Yeshua bar Marmo in the name of Rabbi Yeshua. Meaning in our Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer cites it just in the name of Rabbi Yeshua. And in this source, in this brisa, he's citing the name of Rabbi Yeshua bar Marmo in the name of Rabbi Yeshua. And what did I hear? Kol tumah min hamesha nazir megalecho chayav la mishum pias mikdash. Kol tumah min hamesha ina nazir megalecho in chayav la mishum pias mikdash. So and he cites in our Mishnah. He says that he's only liable if it's something that the Nazir would have to cut his hair over. So Have Mishum Rabbi Yeshua ben Marmo Gamerla. So we see from here in this brisa, Rabbi Eliezer didn't learn his teaching just straight from Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya. He learned it first from Rabbi Yeshua ben Marmo. So the Gemara says, okay, Shema Mina, we learned from here an important point, that why doesn't our Mishnah cite it in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Marmo and then in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya? So we learn from here an important point called Shemaitata, the Mesama, the Beit Lasa, Kadmal Basrai Amrina, Mitziyah Lo Amrina. Any teaching which was said in front of 3 people, then you really only have to cite the first one and the last one, but you don't have to cite the middle one. Meaning to say you don't have to say every single person who taught something. You just have to say the beginning and the end because otherwise it's too much. And the Gemara says, and a similar story like this is Amar Nachum Bar Yitzchak. Says we have a similar teaching that Amar Nachum Halavlar, Nachum the scribe once taught Kachim Kublani mi Rabbi Miyayish. He said one time I learned from Rabbi Miyasha Shekibo Me'aba. He heard the tradition from his father. Shekibo Menazugos, who heard it from the pairs. The pairs, presumably, who are the pairs? There's a reference to. These are the Tanaim that are mentioned in Maseches Avos, chapter 1, Mishnah 4. It says. Yossi ben Yoel, there's a whole series of pairs, and he said, who heard it from them? Shekibu min Neviim, and then it skips Kalev and Yoshua, and it says, Allah Moshe Sinai. So, by the way, ironically, in this whole teaching about Yoshua ben Ramon, Yoshua ben Peter, Yoshua ben Hananya, it skips Yoshua in this price, the Yoshua. So then he said, "V'u Yoshua v'kolev lo kochashev." Oh wait, what was the teaching? The teaching was Bezoreya Sheves v'chardel, that if you sow dill and mustard in 2 or 3 places, that you have to give a corner of the field from each one. That was the halacha. But Yoshua bar the Kalev lo kochashev, he didn't count Yoshua and Kalev. So we see from here, he skipped the middle one. He only had said the end one. And the Gemara says, Shema Mina, you don't need to say it. Why did he only skip Yoshua and Kalev? Why didn't he skip all the other middle ones? So it's not that you're not allowed to mention them, but you're not required to. So we want to teach us that halacha. So next Mishnah, I'm Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said, one time I taught halacha in front of Rabbi Eliezer, and I made a kal v'chomer. I said, Ma'am etzem k'se'ora, just like if you have a bone the size of the barley corn. She'ein matame adam ba'oel, that if it's in a tent, and a person's in that tent, they don't become tummy if the bone is just the size of the barley grain. But yet, a Nazir megalech hamago, but the Nazir would get, but the Nazir would have to cut his hair if he touched it, or if he carried it, and he'd have to start over as Naziris. Revius dam, a quarter look of blood, shumatami adam ba'ol, that if it is in a tent with a person, the Nazir would have to cut his hair. And excuse me, it reveals dam that if a person was in a tent with it, the person would become tamei. For sure, if the Nazir touches this revius of dam, he'd have to, or carries it, he'd have to cut his hair. Meaning, if the etzem kesaor, if the bone the size of the barley does not require requires by touching the Nazir to cut his hair, for sure the quarter look of blood, because an etzem kesaor does not transmit tumah in the tent, but the quarter look of blood does. So Amar Ali, Rabbi Eliezer said to me, Maza Akiva, why are you saying this, Akiva? Ain't done in Kami Kavachomer. You can't learn out a Kavachomer from a bone the size of the barley. Ukishabati vertzeiti advar mufnei Rabbi Yoshua. When I said this to Rabbi Yoshua, Amar Ali Yafa Marta. He said, yeah, your logic is sound. But what they taught was that this is Allah Moshe Sinai, that the Nazir cuts for touching the barley corn, and he doesn't cut his hair for touching the blood, and you can't learn out a Kavah Chomer from Allah Moshe Sinai. And so therefore you can't learn that a Nazir has to cut his hair for touching a Revius dam. So the Gemara on the top of Nitzayin Amin Aleph says, Ibailu etzem kisora alacha Revius dam Kavah Chomer. What was the halacha Moshe Sinai? Was halacha Moshe Sinai the bone the size of the barley corn that the Nazir cuts his hair if he touches it, and the quarter look of blood was what we tried to learn a Kavah Chomer from, and we don't learn out a Kavah Chomer from the halacha Moshe Sinai. Or maybe what's the halacha Moshe Sinai? That if you're in a tent with a quarter look of blood, that you become tamei. That's the halacha. The etzem kisaora, and the bone the size of the barley corn is the Kavah Chomer, meaning to say that you can learn out a Kavah Chomer that from the Revius dam to the bone the size of the barley corn, and to tell us that and we want to learn out from the bone the size of barley corn to that a Kavah Chomer that the Revius dam you'd also have to, if you touch it, you also have to cut his hair. And we don't learn out this Kavah Chomer from this halacha. So the Gemara says no. The way to read it is Tashma etzem kisora halacha. The halacha Moshe Sinai is the halacha. Revius dam is the Kavah Chomer, and we're going to say that Revius dam was what he wanted to learn out the Kavah Chomer. Vein down in Kavah Chomer melacha. You can't learn out this Kavah Chomer from this halacha Moshe Sinai. All right, we'll stop this Hadron Alach Kohen Gadol. We will return to you to this beautiful chapter of Kohen Gadol. And if you want to hear more about it, tune into the 1 minute daf on the YouTube, which I'll be posting, God willing, in just a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, happy to address.
Yeah, sure.